The icy, synth-laden textures of this album perfectly serves its dystopian themes. One might argue it's their bleakest album. Rush's 10th studio album takes its title from an Ernest Hemingway quote which focuses upon the dire circumstances of people's lives and the need to act with grace under pressure. And pressure being the key word here, as the band was certainly experiencing some issues with this album in terms of its production. Interestingly, this was the first Rush album since 1975's Fly By Night not to be produced by Terry Brown. According to AllMusic, this resulted in a slightly more accessible sound than its predecessor Signals, as the band were certainly dissatisfied with the production on that record. Brown's replacement was Peter Henderson, who had produced such pop alumni as Paul McCartney and Supertramp. But it was in keeping with the spirit of the band, if not the radio, that they fully embraced the MTV age. And as Martin Popoff says, Rush seemed to have made a well-timed shift into preppy adulthood, haircuts included, but no kimonos, thankfully. Rush had approached producer Steve Lillywhite to work with them on this album, but I think he was offered a more lucrative deal with Simple Minds. And he left the band to self-produce until Henderson was hired. And the band and the new producer spent 14 hours a day perfecting the sound on this record, which is why it sounds so bloody marvellous, and could be a contender for certainly one of their best albums. This denotes the beginning of the end for those Rush fans who feel that synths and electronics were used too prominently, in effect pushing guitarist Alex Lifeson into sonic exile on this record. Lifeson doesn't so much as announce himself on this album as haunt it from the margins. Although in saying that, check out his brilliant shimmering guitar work on Body Electric, and Kid Gloves for that matter. Although Lifeson described Grace Under Pressure as the most satisfying of all our records. Their sound was moving away from that heavy prog of the 70s towards more minimalistic electronic sound, incorporating new technologies. But it speaks to the band's artistic curiosity, searching for the new with little regard for their legacy. LP Hartley said, "The past is a foreign country, they do things differently there." And for Rush, the idea that that was then and this is now is certainly driven home with this record. Grace Under Pressure, with its exploration of Cold War paranoia intentions, gets better every time I listen to it. There's a chilliness to the sound that is just magnificent. These bright and icy textures, which of course were a result in the technology the band were exploring, perfectly serve Peart's lyrics and themes on this bleak album. But Rolling Stone hated it. No surprise there, of course. I mean, Kurt Loder wrote in his article, "The problem, though, is musical. On record, the lack of melody in any but the most rudimentary harmonic development soon becomes oppressive. In addition, Alex Lifeson is not a particularly interesting lead guitarist, and the structures of the trio format still result in more splattery drum bashing than you'll ever care to hear. Rush delivers the goods, all right, strong social statements enveloped in a massive pounding sound, but it's old news. And old music too." The melodic impetus of this record is provided by the aforementioned synths, replacing Alex Lifeson's guitar, which surrenders the usual power chords and soloing for sharp strums, flange-infused motifs, and even jazz and reggae elements. Not that the band weren't exploring these elements on albums like From Permanent Waves onwards, really. But I don't agree with Rolling Stone at all. I think there's some wonderfully inventive arrangements on this record. Distant Early Warning, After Image, Red Sector, and Between the Wheels. The composition and structures are exact and exquisite, as it delves some rather dark and disconcerting themes. And the album is almost so mid-80s, almost Newman-esque in terms of its employment of different technology. But there's no doubt the synths really affect the atmosphere on this record. They bring an iciness, gloom and shudder to Neil Peart's unsettling lyrics. But what I love about this record most of all is moving away from the fantasy and arcane themes of the 1970s to provide us with a collection of songs that very much deal with real people and real situations. Neil Peart's writing was moving in that direction from Permanent Waves onwards. It shows a real maturing, I think. Neil Peart said of this record, "Grace Under Pressure was not just about metaphysical things. It was about my friends, people who were having trouble. The key line in Distant Early Warning is, 'You sometimes drive me crazy, but I worry about you.' That's the ultimate expression of compassion, and I used a William Faulkner title in that too, Absalom, Absalom. This story from the Bible where King David allowed his son to die, and the plea is, would God have died for thee? The ultimate expression of compassion. A lot of the music has a stabbing, quite abrasive quality to it. It lacks emotion. For any kind of emotional connection with this music, we have to rely on Geddy Lee's vocal performances, which juxtaposes the machine-like frostiness of the music. The album perfectly captures the zeitgeist of that 1980s nuclear paranoia, which was an emotive topic in the West, with numerous plays and docudramas dealing with a post-Holocaust Britain struggling to deal with the ravages of a nuclear fallout. Just a few years prior to Grace Under Pressure, Kate Bush had a hit with Breathing that focuses on a child in utero having to live under the auspices of the mushroom cloud and breathe in the radiation via its mother's bloodstream. Bleak stuff. And let's not forget Floyd's chilling Two Suns in the Sunset from the final cut in 1983. And Raymond Briggs' When the Wind Blows in 1982 dealt with a couple trying to survive the fallout after a Soviet nuclear attack. Grace Under Pressure fits perfectly in that dark lexicon of post-apocalypse scenarios and Cold War frostiness being explored through the music and literature. But it is the Cold War that is frequently referenced on this album. These compositions serve as clear warnings from history. In the Cold War era of the mid-1980s, lots of bands fed into the narrative of expressing concerns about the nuclear arms race. The songs were dark and pessimistic. Rush certainly achieve a specific sound on this album that resists the heaviness of the 1970s, instead preferring the weight and heaviness to be expressed through the lyrics. And interestingly, Geddy Lee's vocals are less rangy, I think, dispensing with that glass-worrying shriek to sing in a more almost conversational tones. Piet's drumming is snappy and authoritative, and Lifeson's ringing, flanged, open chords all contribute to this sonic panorama that is this album. Nevertheless, the elements of prog proper are certainly apparent here as they explore different time signatures and textures and atmospheres on this album. And after the album was released, of course, there was the tour, which kicked off, I think, May the 7th, 1984 in Albuquerque. It was supported by Gary Moore, initially anyway. I think he was replaced by the Pat Travis Band and Fast Away a bit later on. But anyway, let's think about the songs on this record. Distant Early Warning has been described by one critic as a dystopian travelogue. A rumble of synthetic noise quickly gives way to the electronic drums and blatantly contemporary new wave sound that defines this album. As we listen, we bristle at references to acid rain. It's a dialogue on the very nature of powerlessness when faced with imminent ruination. And the need to protect our children is certainly touched upon. In fact, the video featured a child sat aside a missile, an obvious allusion to the wonderful Stanley Kubrick movie Dr. Strangelove. On this one, a greater sense of musical harmony between synths, guitars and percussion is established, more so than Signals, I think. Distant Early Warning is a perfect synergy of lyrics and music. It's a track that explores global tensions, and we don't have to look too far to survey the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with this one, and how close we came to a nuclear meltdown during the Cuban Missile Crisis in '63, I believe. This was to be a serious reflection on humanity and how we cope and avert catastrophe. And I love the way the synth conjures up the sound of an alarm at the beginning of this one. After Image is an interesting song as it deals with the loss of a loved one, beautifully captured in the lyric. Suddenly you were gone from all the lives you left your mark upon. The song is about the ghosts that we leave behind, I think, especially after a sudden death. And the song speaks painfully of loss and regret, and that emotion is part communicated by Alex Lifeson's tremoloed guitar. This song does seem firmly rooted in the 1980s. There's an interesting juxtaposition with the profound lyrical themes and the breeziness of 80s rock. One critic said that it's as if Rush's plan was to juxtapose darkness with pop's accessibility to coincide and subvert modern music. Red Sector is the third track on this album, and it's one that deals quite profoundly with the horrors of the World War II concentration camps. A theme, of course, an idea that was very personal for this band, specifically Geddy Lee, of course, with beautiful lines like, "Ragged lines of ragged grey skeletons they shuffle away." This is of course a ghastly topic, and one very personal for Geddy Lee, as I've just said. I love the line, "cut down the lucky ones," which is followed by a drum flourish which sounds like the spray of gunfire. The Enemy Within concludes the Fear trilogy, which begins with Witch Hunt on Moving Pictures and The Weapon on Signals, and the lyrics probe quite skillfully into the mind of a troubled individual. The Body Electric has a driving mechanistic sound which perfectly serves the theme of this one, the urge for escape and deliverance. In this case, the subject of the song is an android, and the lyrics portray the story of an android that develops human feelings and realises that it's a slave to its human creators. A wonderful science fiction number worthy of the great Isaac Asimov. Kid Gloves is an interesting one. It deals with the trials of a growing up, I think, and looking for acceptance. Could easily be a companion piece to Subdivisions from the Signals album. And wonderful guitar work on this, perfectly demonstrating how Lifeson's guitar on this record punctuates rather than forms the canvas for Peart's lyrics. Red Lens is a commentary on communism, especially its presence in the 20th century, and it fits perfectly thematically into the feel of this album. Neil Peart says of this one, "I can take someone like T.S. Eliot, who has influenced me greatly over the last few years, and realise that what he was doing was just throwing so many images at you all the time, but you were left feeling a bit dizzy. But at the same time you were left with something. You were stepping into another dimension. So I used that idea on a song like Red Lenses from the Grace Under Pressure album. I tried to construct a series of ongoing images that just came at you. The colour red was the theme of it, but I twisted it in so many ways." Between the Wheels is an interesting one. It seems to be about the march of time and the frustration inherent in the inability to kind of seize or freeze that moment. I wonder if it's a pun on John Lennon's Watching the Wheels. But we tend to hang on to the past, especially when the future looks bleak and we're not particularly happy with the present. And the synths combine beautifully with the guitars here. That makes this sonically at least a really interesting number. This was a theme, of course, that the band revisit for songs like Time Stands Still. So that concludes my review of Rush's Grace Under Pressure, which I think is one of their finest albums. Do you agree or disagree? Please do leave a comment below and let me know what you think of this record. I urge you, if you've enjoyed this review, to share it and also to click like, subscribe and check that notification bell. Check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at the channel. It's always much appreciated. And other than that, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.